on to Lesley, Q, Hammond, and Jose. All right, so they're battling who's going to speak first. So I'll hand the mic over to you. Since he cracked it. So Lesley, could you give us a little bit of your background, please?
Okay. Excuse me, I have to find my way to the circle.
Yes.
Or the triangle. Am I correct? Okay, very good. Thank you. I was born and raised in New York City, born in South Bronx, South Queens. From an Afro-Caribbean family that came from Barbados. They migrated all of them. So I'm like the first generation born and raised in this country. My parents were born in the islands and then sent back later on and raised and then came back again. But I'm the first one I had total experience here. As far as I could ever remember, I was always interested in the process of making things, and I never really in the beginning saw it as art because my grandmother was a seamstress in the Bronx district. My father was a shipfitter in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and he would build submarines and aircraft carriers, and he was a master carpenter. And he would then, is this better? He would then come home, and anything that needed repairing in the house or building in the house, he would do it. I have 3 siblings, a brother like next to me, and then 2 younger sisters. And as my father was building, my brother had absolutely no interest in it. So when my father was laying sheetrock, I would be right there because I just loved the idea of putting materials together to make something. I also was fascinated with how my grandmother could take a piece of cloth or scraps without a pattern and just cut and put them together. So it was the abstraction of that process, and that's where I began my whole career. I became a Girl Scout later on, and in the Girl Scout troop I was the arts and one who would make stuff for the whole troop. My life is a journey. I spent a lot of time, training students and telling them have a master plan and all of this. And when they asked me, I just, if it looks strange or different, I'm going to go down that road. Because to me, that is where the essence of life and the juice of the experience that you're trying to capture can be found. It's in the experience of discovery. So I always find myself on a journey. The fact that I'm in this show, I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around. And even though Myrtis asked us to do this, and I knew that it was the right thing to do, but it wasn't something that I was really enraptured with doing, because when I do my art, it's like a very personal, intimate, daily ritual thing to me, and it's how I cleanse myself and I refocus myself. I spent my career academically, and I have a PhD from Johns Hopkins University. I have a BFA in Fine Arts from Queens College in New York. So when I decided to switch over to academia, it was because I got a scholarship. But it was also because I realized that in the whole experience of being a person from the African diaspora, I could never find anybody in the arts when I was growing up. There were few and far between. Not only that, I was never affirmed in my life that this was a proper vocation for me. As I continued to stay in the arts, and my family would question me, and they would say, "Why are you doing that? She's a little strange." It's still a little strange. I continue to be strange. I sort of revel in my strangeness. But the one thing that I did recognize is that that's what made me happy. That's what made me whole. That's what gave me focus. And that's where I was when I was out of order. I always had to go back to making my art to get myself focused and disciplined and centered, always centered. And the only thing that ever centered me was when I was doing my art. All right? It's like a mantra. You go back into the center of yourself. So it never occurred to me that I was, I knew there was art, and I was helping all these artists get at shows all over the place, and I'm writing their catalogs and whatever. And I go home and make my art. And then one day, a very good friend of mine, Deborah Willis, decided to out me. And that is, dragged me out of the closet, and she did a show in about, I guess it was 96, 97, sometime around there, called Artist Scholar, and she decided to look at scholars who had sort of given up their aesthetic lives in order to advance the cause of writing and curating. So I was in a show with David Driscoll. I was in a show with Arturo Lindsay. I was in a show, the same show, Floyd Coleman, and Israel's Adewale. All of these individuals had spent a lot of time teaching and writing about art, but I was the only woman in the show, and it was really quite revelatory and very terrifying. It was at the Smithsonian, and it was a moment. It was a moment where I inadvertently found myself at a crossroads, a crisis where I couldn't write anymore, and I had reached what is that proverbial writer's block, and I realized that I had reached this impasse because in order to continue writing, I had to stop and go back to my art to work out certain issues. There was a void. So I was explaining this process to Deborah Willis because I talked, in those days we talked, God, I know we should have had stock in AT&T. My telephone bills literally were no less every month than $300 to $500 because my colleagues and I, Deborah Willis and Laurie Sims and Trutopia Benjamin, we would consult from like midnight to 2 o'clock in the morning. And we would just work through stuff. And this one night I was kind of like having a meltdown with Deborah. And she said, that's it. And I said, what? She says, you're in the show. I said, what show? She said, I'm doing an Artist Scholar show and you are in the show. So at that moment, I said, okay. I allowed for her to come to the house to look at the work. And she came in the front door and I said, well, let's go upstairs to my studio where it is. And she said, no. She said, what's that? And I said, oh, and I have a 3-story townhouse like this, and there are fireplaces, and I had turned one of the mantles into an altar. I said, that's my altar. I said, come on, let's go upstairs. She said, nope. She told her sister, write that down. And so she said, no, we're going to do the first floor first. We went through every floor. She said, okay, take that, take that, take that. And everything that I had done had been something that had been built or constructed or had been pulled together to kind of like give resolution to a piece of my life, all right? And as we got to the 3rd floor, the checklist was filled, and she said, okay. She said, we'll send the truck, we'll come and get everything. So my son is in school in New York, and he knows that I'm having this show at the Smithsonian, and he's like, oh, what? You know, what is this about? I said, well, they're gonna have an exhibition, I'm gonna be in it, my artwork. He said, what artwork? He says, I'm coming down. He says, I'll drive you over to the Smithsonian. I said, thank you, because I was too nervous to drive. It was raining that night. So we get over to the Smithsonian. They had given me a huge gallery, my own space within the Arts and Industries building. And I had filled this space, and it was just like, it was overwhelming. I was choking. I was literally almost claustrophobic because my whole life was all in on top of me. And my son walks into this gallery and he looks around. He says, you know, I'm coming to see what this is that you do, that's your art. And he looks around and he says, damn, Mom, did you bring the whole house? I said, how would you know? You grew up in this. I said, you were in the middle of helping me construct this. I have pictures of you sitting on my lap while I'm weaving. And this stuff, so you don't know any difference. And then he walks up to the altar, similar to something like this, only it was a much more complex altar, to my grandmother. He goes up to the altar and he points and he goes, I was looking for the hot sauce. How come it's here in the middle? This morning I was making, he said, there's my sauce. Because we made stuff. We didn't have money, so we made everything, all right? The idea of doing this piece with my partner, it has many hilarious stories for which we don't have a lot of time. However, I will say this, that this is the first real kind of installation. He and I have done several other collaborative pieces together. Again, his life is similarly a journey, and our coming together was a process of 2 years of resistance because we were introduced by friends who thought that I was a little strange and artsy, and that he was a little strange and artsy, and that maybe if these two strange artsy people talk together, they might help the social grouping because we were sort of difficult to mingle with because the conversation would get a little artsy, too artsy for them. So they said, put the two weird people together. But for 2 years, he didn't want to talk to me and I didn't want to talk to him. And then when we started to talk, it was like, okay, maybe we have a basis of a conversation. And the greatest irony was that at the moment where we started to kind of create a real baseline of communication, it was 9/11. It was 9/11, and I met Micah, and I had agreed, because it was just after I had come out of the closet to be an artist. I had said to them, okay, I'll be in the faculty show, and I was going to put a piece of artwork with it. When 9/11 happened, I told them no, I was not going to do it. I'm too upset, too hysteria. And one of my students is walking by the door, and he hears me telling the gallery director that I'm not being in the show. And this student begins to cuss me out. This is the moment when I meet him, because I had then had to recommit to doing this piece. And I meet him, and now I give the mic to
Okay.
you.